Okay. Thank you, Alexis. All right, sweetie people, happy to see you all. Everybody's here, Barbara and everybody. Happy to see you all. So just thinking we're going to be here for this little minutes, few minutes less than normal, to think about the mind, think about life. Interestingly, today we had, talk with the national group, and there was a talk with the Indian group. And the Indian group has been taught, we talked about how to heal trauma, which is kind of interesting. And I get always joke and get a bit cynical. You must have heard me always, whenever we talk in the West, in modern psychology, we always use Greek words, and we've got our own very particular way of seeing things, haven't we? So when we say trauma, it's very powerful for us. We really understand it. But, Buddha didn't use the word trauma. He didn't speak Greek. He spoke Indian. He spoke Sanskrit. Or no, he probably spoke Pali. I don't know, whatever the language was. And so the word that gets translated for the Buddha, when we've got problems, the word is called suffering. So we call it trauma. And usually, so when suffering is a broad word, isn't it? Suffering includes having a knee ache or so we probably wouldn't call that a trauma. So usually I think, I'm not so sure, but probably we think about trauma, well, maybe no, when it's a really deep suffering, probably when it's a very heavy suffering, So, yeah, so this is Buddha's deal. He's found methods to stop suffering. So in other words, he's found methods to stop having trauma. We should put it that way. But so often, I think I mentioned this morning, so often what happens is because Buddha's, if you read Buddhism in a very traditional way, from the Indian text, from the Tibetan text, from Tibet, you're talking about 8th century, and they still talk the same way. If you hear a very classical, traditional Tibetan person giving a teaching, you would read the same words with the same constructs, the same ideas, the same approach as you would have 1200 years ago, 1000 years ago, 800 years ago. So sometimes that's one of the biggest problems for us modern people. When we first hear the very traditional Buddhist teachings, it seems really kind of it doesn't seem very immediate. It doesn't seem like it talks like we talk. And that's why someone like Lama Yeshe was so amazing. I mean, Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa both met Western students, the hippies, in the 70s at the same time. And Rinpoche still talks. I mean, he talks to modern people. Of course, he's got his students. He's had modern students for 45 years, more than that, nearly 50 now. But he still talks in a more traditional way than the way Lama Yeshe did, almost immediately. So when he talks, we think, oh, he understands. Oh, Lama Yeshe gets it, Many people will say, oh, well, Tibetans don't get it because they don't have the same experience as we do. But, the thing that I think we've got to see is, and that's got to come from our own experience, if we're trying to use Buddhism, let's say, Buddha was born 2,500 years ago. These people are talking from ancient history, But if there's something fundamentally true there, we've got to find that out. I know my very first teachings, I stumbled into these teachings by Lama Zopa and Lama Yeshe when I was about 31 or something. And in the beginning, I didn't have a clue what Lama Zopa was saying. I had no idea what he was talking about, because he was discussing this lam rim. He was describing this traditional packaging of the teachings, describing, impermanence and all these things. And it just seemed so abstract. It seemed so, why is he telling me all this? It just seemed so unimmediate. I didn't know how to get my head around it, But then Lama Yeshe would come and give a talk, and I'd go, oh, I'd sigh with relief. Thank goodness that, because one of the things with us, when we think of something like Buddhism, we usually turn to it because we've got some problems. We've got some trauma, if you like, or we're trying to deal with trauma. We're trying to deal with our depression, or deal with our anxiety, or deal with our crummy relationships. Or when we're not happy, that's inevitably we're looking for solutions, and that's a good thing. Nothing wrong with looking for solutions. But to hear, the traditional presentation of the Buddhist lam rim, where you listen to this deep philosophical teachings about the nature of the universe and blah blah, it just seems so utterly abstract. It seems so as if it's got nothing to do with anything. So it's really hard for us to hear this. So then anyway, I'm just talking away, So Lama Yeshe had this ability. He talked about immediately. He talked in the most immediate, direct way. And that's what's interesting. I mean, I'm his daughter, basically. He's my teacher, So, we need to talk in an immediate way because we've got immediate problems. And so the thing is, then okay, I'm just chatting here. So what am I getting to? I mean, as we can see, every talk we have, it's dealing with immediate things. It's dealing with, what do I do when my husband's mean? What do I do when I'm depressed? Because that's finally, so this is the interesting point. Finally, that is what Buddhism is all about. That's finally what it is all about. That's why you would study philosophy. That's why you would study the teachings about karma. That's why you would study emptiness. That's why you would study all these things, because within all of the teachings are the tools to slowly do this job of transforming one's mind from a limited, neurotic, limited person to a sublime, amazing, powerful, blissful, clear person. This is really the essence of it. And I think it's why it's so important to hear that that's why we're trying to do it, That's why we're using Buddhism. Even if we use 1% of it, that's the reason. We've got to find the tools, It's just, it also happens to be that Buddha's view from his own findings is that the degree to which we can develop ourselves, it sounds like science fiction. If you hear the qualities of a person who has become what is called a Buddha, if you hear the qualities, it's definitely science fiction. It would be completely, just like it sounds insane, So that's also the point. Buddha deals with the most simple things, but he's got this extraordinary view from his own experience of what's possible, of how much we can accomplish, how much we can develop ourselves, Anyway, I'm just talking here. So trauma. We can see when, so this is where, again, we come right down to the basics. Like, what is the cause of this? Why is it, let's say, one of the terms in modern psychology, one of the problems they talk about, it's, what's it called? Oh, I don't know. I can't remember. There's all these different terms we use. And one of the discussions, let's say, about trauma would be that something terrible happened when you were little, and you didn't deal with it then, because and this is part of the suffering, we don't know how to deal with difficulties, and so what do we do with it? We get all neurotic and ridiculous and all twisted inside, and then develop all these habits of anger or resentment and hurt and jealousy and to protect ourselves, because we don't have techniques, we don't have methods. So what I find so fascinating is one of the Buddhist things is this is one of their views about the mind. There's not a single thing that anybody experiences through their eyes, ears, nose, the five senses, or their mind. There's not a single thing we experience that doesn't get stored in the mind. Nothing goes astray. There's no, the Buddhist view, in fact, is the level to which we can have good memory, literally to see the past and the future, is stupendous. Our mind has this ability. So in other words, we've got the ability to remember things. When our mind is more clear, when our mind is less neurotic, we can recall, we can see the past, we can even see the future, we can see the experiences of others. The mind is incredibly powerful. So one of our biggest problems is, of course, we've all had bad things happen, but at the time, we don't know how to deal with it. We're little children. We don't know how to deal with some traumatic experience, like our mother abusing us, or our father being unkind, or the next door neighbor doing something terrible. And we've got to analyze. This is what, when we talk about trauma, we've really got to analyze and use the Buddhist analysis to understand why that is. And that comes down, again, as simple as it sounds, as simplistic as it sounds. But if we look at the Buddhist model properly, in the Four Noble Truths, there is Buddha's presentation of, number one, there is suffering. And there are different levels of suffering. Suffering is another word for trauma. Now, meaning the first level of suffering, and this is the level we're discussing here, by the way, the level we mostly discuss when we say trauma is the first kind. It's when the bad things happen. That's my simple way of putting what suffering is. It's when the bad things happen. Think about it. It's when the bad things happen. Then you call it suffering. The knee ache. Who wants a knee ache? Who wants an abusive husband? Who wants a bomb to drop on your house? Who wants all these terrible things to happen? Nobody. So this is the simplest level of suffering. Forget about the more subtle level, okay? The simplest level of suffering is when the bad things happen. I think that's what we mean by trauma. So then we look at the Buddha's teachings. Let's have a look at what Buddha says. Let's look at what Buddha says. Buddha's got his own explanation for, one, there is suffering. You first have to identify the problem. But then the second one is he's got his presentation of what are the causes. I mean, if we've read any Buddhism, we might have heard the Four Noble Truths. It sounds pretty simple. One, there is suffering. Two, there are causes. Three, you can get rid of suffering and its causes. It's such a shocking statement, you almost can't believe it. And four, how to do it. So let's look at the causes. It's almost too simple for us. It almost seems like it's not possible. That'd be ridiculous. And there are precisely two causes. There are precisely two main causes of why bad things happen to us. Hear my point, as blunt as it is, you know. There are precisely two main causes for me experiencing a trauma. The first one is called karma, and this is dealt with at the very beginning of Buddha's teachings. You start to listen to Buddha's extraordinary view, his explanation, his presentation from his own direct experience of what the universe is, of what it is, and what happiness is, and what suffering is, and the process of what causes suffering. You flip that over, it also answers the question, what is happiness? It's the same. It's exactly the same. He's got his own explanations of why it is beings experience what they experience. So the very first one is called karma. So whether you're looking for the cause of a happiness or the cause of suffering, the cause of a trauma or the cause of a joyful experience, whatever words you like, then we're looking at this concept of karma. It's Buddha's explanation of why the universe exists, how it exists. I mean, it's a big question. It seems kind of vast, you know. The scientists have got their own views. Different religions have their views. Other philosophers have their views. Christians have their views. Hindus have their views. There are lots of views around the world over the centuries that clever humans have come up with, isn't it? They're explanations of the universe and what it is. Well, that's the view of karma for the Buddha, as surprising as it is to us. And basically what it is that there are trillions upon trillions upon trillions of consciousnesses, minds, sentient beings, trillions upon trillions. They're not the handiwork of mummy and daddy. They're not a function of the brain. They're not physical. They don't come from someone else. They don't start from nothing. And that our consciousness goes back and back and back and back and back. Number one. Number two, very simply, the principle of this law of karma, and as far as Buddha is concerned, it's a natural law. He didn't make it up. He's not imposing it on anybody. He's observed it with his noggin, with his intelligence, that every millisecond of what any sentient being thinks and does and says is the process of, quote unquote, creating karma. Meaning everything we think and do and say programs our mind, sows seeds in our mind that unless we pull those seeds out, will just naturally ripen in the future. Seeds always ripen in the future as our experiences. So as this Holiness of Dalai Lama says, karma is self-creation. I mean, it sounds simple. It's all there. All the principles are there. It's up to us if we're interested in it, to look into it, to study it, to analyze it. So basically, the first cause of suffering, flip it over, the first cause of happiness is the imprints in my own mind from the past of doing certain actions that are now ripening as a painful experience or ripening as a happy experience. I mean, now that's already so shocking we can't even hear it. That's not the Christian teaching. That's not the materialist teaching. That's not the Jewish teaching, unless you're Kabbalah Jew. I remember I was part of a conference in Miami. I forgot, 30 years ago or something. I can't remember. And the topic was why do bad things happen to good people? But you could just as easily have the topic why do good things happen to bad people. You could just as easily ask that. And that was the topic. And it was me, a rabbi, a Catholic priest, and a Lutheran. It sounds like a joke, doesn't it? But it was true. And so we each gave our presentation of why do good things happen to bad people? Or it could have just as been, why do bad things happen to good people? No, that one. That was the point, wasn't it? And so I, of course, presented karma, you know. So I remember that the rabbi clapped and he said, we've got the same view. All the Jews in the audience were gobsmacked because he said he was a Kabbalah Jew. So they have this view of reincarnation and karma. It's very interesting, you know. So this is a philosophical view that's actually been around for centuries. You know, it's the Indians came up with this before the Buddha. So it's been good 3,000, 4,000 years. This philosophical view of the universe coming from the view of these yogis is that view that everything we think and do and say produces the person we become. But of course, as soon as we hear that, it so totally contradicts and smashes into the various assumptions we have based upon the materialist view, because you didn't ask to get born, you know, nothing is your fault. You're born to your mother, your father, they make you, and then bad things happen. So of course we're confused. We have no idea why bad things happen. We don't know why good things happen either. But very oddly, I think I've always mentioned this, I've never yet had any person on the planet ever ask me the question, Robina, why do good things happen? We only ever ask, why do the bad things happen? It's interesting. So that's the first thing. And then so that you hear that and you go, oh, that's interesting. You mean this trauma that I experienced was the result of some action I did? And if we weren't neurotic, we'd go, that's interesting. I haven't thought of that before. Let me look at it. But of course, we have a mental breakdown when we hear it. It's just impossible to underhear it. It's too painful because we have such different views in our mind right now. That view smashes completely into the current view that we have, that we are all didn't ask to get born. Listen to that phrase. We joke and say, I didn't ask to get born, but it's what we truly believe. So that would be, so of course, if you didn't ask to get born, obviously all the good that happens to you, all the good things that happen to you have nothing to do with you. That's like good luck. And then all the bad things happen have nothing to do with you either. And they're all just bad luck. In fact, that's how we think. We actually think that. We think life is good luck and bad luck, don't we? So it's very interesting when we hear this philosophical presentation, it just smashes into the current views we have that we didn't even think were viewpoints. We just think it's natural. Oh, yes, it's good luck and bad luck. No one knows why things happen. No one knows why Hitler. No one knows why, blah, blah, blah. We say like that. We talk like that. Buddha says, no, I've got a presentation of why it happened. It's up to you if you'd like to look at it. It's so shocking for us. So now, okay, one of the causes is a past action I must have done in one of my countless past lives, because everything I think and do and say sows seeds in my mind. So then we can see in our life, one way of framing your whole life is, in one sense, is very simple. Look at your life. You can frame it in terms of happy experiences and unhappy experiences. Think about it. There's a third category. They call them neutral. Well, forget those. We can talk this way. Since we're born, if you think about it, we've had experiences that are quite pleasant, some very pleasant. There are some that are awful and some are very awful. So it's almost like, and if you look at our lives, it's almost instinctive that we try to do and find and say and get the things that we think will cause us to have happy experiences, and we try to avoid the other ones. It's kind of primordial. The dogs and the monkeys do the same. So it's one way of framing all the Buddha's view, really, in terms of why happiness, why suffering. Well, that's his first answer. General law of karma. Then the second one, there are two main causes as far as Buddha is concerned. He calls it delusions. So this becomes when all we ever talk about is the mind. We have to analyze the mind, and we see in the mind there are, Buddha's analysis is there are these states of mind that are really kind of awful, painful, disturbing, neurotic, delusional, dreadful to have, attachment, anger, jealousy, low self-esteem, pride, resentment, you name it. That's just a simple level. One of the words for those is delusions. So then we go, oh, I see. So an action I did with my body and speech, driven by a delusion, those two together sowed seeds in my mind, and that haven't yet, that have now suddenly ripened as as a bad thing happening. Now, if that's true, and that's Buddha's analysis, you don't have to believe him. It's up to you to decide, And you flip it over, it's exactly the same with a happy experience. Why is someone kind to me? Like I said, we don't ask that question. We take the good for granted, but we freak out at the bad, which is already itself very interesting to look at. But it's exactly the same analysis. Then I must have done a virtuous action in the past, driven an action with my body and speech, driven by a virtuous state of mind that is now ripening as a happy experience. The Buddha's point is, well, if this is the analysis, and if you know you do want happy experiences and don't want suffering ones, that's why he's saying you can fix it. Stop doing negative things and start doing positive things. It's the very first level of practice, really. And of course, we're talking long term. So why trauma? What does it mean? Well, because you see, we have this attachment, which is the main voice of this primordial, as we've talked about, primordial sense of a self, an unhappy sense of self, a separate sense of self. This deep instinctive primordial assumption of a concrete, solid, separate self, deep in the bones of our being. This is Buddha's analysis. And its main voice is this emotional hunger to get what that I wants. It's completely primordial, completely instinctive, deep in our bones. And now this is the point now when it comes to trauma. When that attachment doesn't get what it wants, and that can be the tiniest experience. Your sister was mean to you. You stubbed your toe, or the most intense suffering of someone harming you, abusing you, Then the third delusion is arisen of these three main ones, and that's called aversion. So if you analyze this, use this as an analysis, then when we're little or when we're big even, whatever, we learn a lot of habits when we're very small, don't we? But don't you forget, we come into this life already programmed with a lot of habits, you know. That's the point. We don't come in like a blank slate. We come in already programmed. So, you know, you can come into this life very programmed with very strong attachment, strong emotional hunger to get only the nice things. That's attachment's job. It wants only the nice things. So when an awful thing happens unexpectedly, when you're little, you're so naive when you're small, someone punches you in the nose or abuses you, then depending on your personality, you either punch back, which is anger, or you have incredible fear and you bury it. And that's the commonest thing we do. We bury, we deny, we don't know how to handle it. We don't know how to respond. You know, we don't know how to respond, so we suffocate it. But then from this, we learn habits. We learn to become resentful. We become defensive. And then, but we've buried our memories. We bury most things. So they've got to come out at some point. They've got to come out. They're all in the mind. They're there, vividly in the mind, but we've buried them. So no wonder we're neurotic as we get older. So we've got a sort of part of the job is, you know, we talk like this in therapy, I'm sure, in some way, but the Buddhist view too, the more you become familiar with your mind, the more you see your tendencies, you see your habits, you remember those. You don't so much remember the event. Then by healing your mind, you can heal the trauma. This is the Buddhist approach, you know. And part of the process is seeing it, not living in denial of it, remembering it almost. You can almost say like that. Confronting it, because aversion, anger, wants to smash it away. So if aversion is internalized, then it becomes depression. If it's volatile, you know, you smash out. In both cases, they're a response of aversion, and aversion is the response when attachment doesn't get what it wants, and attachment is the main voice of the primordial mistaken sense of a separate concrete me. I mean, this analysis sounds almost like simplistic, but the more we understand it, the more powerful it is, you know. And then, of course, if we study the Buddhist model of the mind and go into more detail about the other parts of our mind, the names of the different states of mind and the way they all function to produce this person that we are, it's very fascinating. The more we can start to really and truly become our own therapists, really and truly see our tendencies, see why we suffer, why we're so hurt in some situations, what the jealousy is all about, the resentment. It doesn't mean remembering the events. It means looking into the qualities themselves. That's the Buddha's unique approach, you know. So I'm just talking as usual. So now you better ask me some questions. Come on. Anything you like, but on this topic, if you wish. Nothing, nobody. So it really, I mean, yeah, go on, Skylar, good darling, talk to me.
So you were saying to look at the qualities of the event, not just the event. So it's like
the mind, Skylar, what you brought to that event. That's a good way to put it before you go on. So what I'm getting at is, it's like, you know, I use the analogy. Let's say something happened when you're a little girl, or let's say something happened 20 years ago. I don't care. It was an unhappy thing that happened. So there are two people involved. There's you, the recipient of that action, let's say. Then there's the person who did an action to you. So then what we tend to remember is the person. If we do remember anything, we remember the person, but we don't have much awareness of what's going on even now in our mind. And that's what we have to. So by learning about our mind now, what our tendencies are, then that will tell us how we must have responded back then. So it's remembering what's in the mind, not so much the event. Knowing your own mind. You don't have to look back at the past like looking for a needle in a haystack. You look at your mind now. You see your mind now. So if you know your mind, you've got very strong attachment to be loved by somebody, or you've got very strong attachment to this or that, and you've got very strong aversion, and you've got a lot of jealousy, you've got a lot of arrogance, then you put this, you look at this and you see your mind. And so you can deduce, because those qualities were there when you were 3. You can deduce how you would have responded. So it's knowing about the mind. That's the point, not so much the thing, the other person. An event is made up of, in this case, an event is made up of 2 people. One is the victim and one is the harmer, or, you know, whatever. You see my point I'm trying to say, Skylar?
Yeah. So, and then in a way as to like heal the mind would be to kind of apply the opposing quality of the mind. Like I have strong aversion to people. So I'm like, okay, well, apply, everybody's been my mother. So apply.
Yeah, that'd be a good example. I mean, that's one tiny example. The most fundamental job first, that's a more advanced one because that's the compassion wing. But the most fundamental one is getting to become familiar, really knowing our own mind, really becoming familiar and identifying, oh my gosh, there's the jealousy and there's the resentment and there's the pain, there's the hurt, there's the sadness, there's this, there's that. So you've got to see your mind very intimately, and you're able to label the way your mind is. You're able to label those thoughts and those experiences and those emotions, label them very well and very clearly. Not just in a broad sense, but a quite specific sense. That's what we learn to do as we develop. Do you understand that, Skylar? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm definitely becoming more aware. Like I'm not able to, I guess I haven't taken the time yet to label everything, but I'm becoming more aware of like why I don't really have a lot of friends. And more to the point, like I don't have a lot of friends because I'm not paying attention to those that are nice to me. I'm paying attention to those that are harming me.
No, I see. So you are looking at, so you're analyzing. That's good. That's good. You're looking at yourself. It's good. It's good, Skylar. That's it. Whatever.
Yeah.
That's the key job. Instead of the job of, whatever goes on in my mind has got nothing to do with it, and there's all these things on the outside world. That's the unhappy feeling we often have, and then we're really hopeless and we'll just drown in misery if we think that. In other words, I like to put it this way: we're sort of like we all are participants in everything that goes on in our life. We often don't think we are because we don't know ourselves, but we are all participants, and whatever we are inside, that's what we bring to a certain situation, whether it's a good one or a bad one. We bring whatever we are to it. And that's what we have to learn to know, this one here. We have to learn to know, and we don't have to go back into the past. By learning to your mind now, it tells you about how you were in the past, because we got born with these tendencies. We didn't just develop them last week. So we don't have to be mysterious and look into the past and look for a needle in a haystack. Remembering things in the past can help us trigger things, but we have to know our mind. We start now. And we start to see our patterns, to see how we are, and we get to identify those patterns, which means identify particular delusions or particular virtues we have, Then we can deduce how we would have been. And then the other one, and then that really also means learning to more and more become familiar with attachment and aversion. And these are just two of the hundreds of states of mind, but they're pretty primordial. We can get to see the way our aversion arises. Some of us are very volatile and will shout and kick. And some people will be very sensitive and will turn it all inside. And this is a really powerful one to understand how suffering might have happened. For example, when somehow, for some reason, myself, for example, as a little girl, like a lot of girls, a lot of females, we get violence from men. I'm not being personal to men, but it's usually men who are violent. I mean, women are violent too, but you don't get afraid to go out at night because you're worried about some woman some woman attacking you, do we? It's usually the world, being male, you're the ones who get all the blame. So when I was little, men do ridiculous things, especially sexually, So I remember as a very little girl, even a man held me up in the street, stopped me in the street, not held me up. And I remember not being afraid of him, but I could see he was weird. He wanted me to do certain things. And I remember feeling, I kind of got angry with him, but in a good way. I said, you're ridiculous. Go home. You get into trouble. I wasn't afraid. So that's an interesting point I was getting at. That's just one example in my own experience where fear didn't take over, but my own aggression was actually a virtue at the time. I was strongly responded to him. And for some reason, I had some empathy. And so I told him to go off home or get into trouble doing this ridiculous thing. So therefore, I didn't have any trauma. That's the point I'm really getting to. When we don't bury something, or when incredible fear doesn't come, it's fear that causes so much suffering and is what causes so much trauma. And fear is the energy of all the delusions. So if like we're so afraid of somebody else's violence, then so much trauma right then will happen. And then you've already started the pattern, and then it builds up throughout our life. So when you can confront something when it happens, and that's as we work on our minds, we get braver and braver, then we don't suffer so much. This is something that's really true. I didn't suffer from that, because I didn't suppress it. I didn't build up fear as a result. It was like something kind of interesting. As an example, I learned from my own experience. Are you communicating with me, Skylar?
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
I think we suffer so badly when there's fear when we don't know how to deal with that thing when it happened. We didn't know how to deal with it. We become paralyzed because fear takes over. And then we get resentful and we get angry with ourselves. Why didn't we do this? And why didn't we do that? We get furious with ourselves, actually, because we didn't deal with it. We were sort of like, anyway, it's interesting. But just knowing our own mind, Skylar, seeing our patterns and more clearly. And this is quite a hard job because it's not a job we learned how to do, I tell you. So you're on the right track, Skylar. Keep moving. So we've got 3 people up there, Andrew and Cassia and Maka. Come on then.
So I believe Maka's first, Cassia, and then Andrew.
Okay, darling, talk to me, Maka. Yes,
Maka,
sweetheart.
you need to unmute.
Yes, darling.
Thank you
Talk.
for that example about just speaking to that sort of pedophile guy. That really helps me because in my past, I just went into fear and revulsion and—
Yeah, that's right. There you go. That's it. That's a really good example, Maka. And it's normal. I mean, maybe my response wasn't normal. That's just one example. I probably had neurotic responses to other things, but for some reason, I wasn't scared of violence. You know, for some reason, my mind, and I can see many experiences in my life that I was able to deal with it. And mercifully, it turned out well. So therefore, because I dealt with it, there wasn't trauma. There wasn't kind of anger and resentful and fear and drama, because fear is pretty primordial, isn't it? So it's a really good example. I'm not trying to say I'm a saint or anything. It's just my mind, you know, how I dealt with things.
Oh,
and therefore there wasn't so much suffering as a result of it. It's kind of an interesting point, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And trauma is a really interesting subject these days. And
yes, it is.
I'm thinking of my friends and relatives who are First Nations or Native American people, and
yes,
they talk about cultural trauma, intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
And in this continent, a lot of the way that people cope is through bad behaviors like drinking or drugging and these sorts of. And then I'm thinking of the Tibetans who've lost homeland, and the bit I've been around the Tibetans, mostly in Santa Fe, they don't seem to be carrying trauma compared to the
that's the point I'm getting to, Mark. It's so fascinating. It's because if they've been brought up in this system, they've been looking at their mind since they're small. They have the view of karma. They understand. In other words, Maka, the karmic one is pretty powerful. If you buy into the philosophical view of the universe of karma, that we all come into this life programmed with our own past actions, which is a very general statement, but it's a very powerful one, then already there isn't this agony of why is this happening to me, because you have an answer. And then there's so much less trauma because you're able to greet it and you're able to own it, and then you're able to kind of move forward from it. But often we get paralyzed with that question, but why did that happen to me? And we can't get past that. That's where so much of our trauma is. We don't have an explanation. I mean, this is where I'm talking even, you know, any explanation we have, we've all got a philosophy. We just don't realize it. We've all got a view about why things happen. So I remember one time years ago in Malaysia, one flight, you know, Air Malaysia, no, it was Air Asia, one company, one of their flights sank in the ocean, you know, and everybody died. And the 2 Muslim, you know, Malaysian mummy and daddy, one of their daughters was in the flight and she died. And they said to her, how do you feel about the death of your daughter? Well, they said, we are content. She belongs to God, and God has taken her back. Now, you might not agree with that philosophy. I don't. It's not my philosophy, but it's a philosophy. And because that was sincere in their philosophy, that was an explanation for why it happened. So they didn't have this trauma and drama of why did this happen, you know, which is how we are. If we have the philosophical materialist view, there's no view of a creator, there's no view of any past. It's all the causes are out there and we can't see the answer. So really it's very powerful to realize we've all got a philosophy. We just don't know what it is. We have to look into it. And attachment and aversion are the philosophy of an innocent victim. I mean, it sounds pretty brutal to say this. So if we don't have any view of karma, of why things happen, of course, when the smallest thing happens to you, the instinct of I rises so strongly and has a panic attack. But why is this happening? I don't deserve it. I didn't do anything to deserve this. And you didn't, not now. So it really means we've got to unpack what our view is. Those people had a very different philosophy, but because of that view, they weren't traumatized. They didn't suffer. So the Buddha view is so fundamental, this attachment and aversion, which are the main voices of this ego grasping. You know, those plus the view of karma, if you're equipped with those, which is a very typical Tibetan one, they don't suffer so badly. That's why I always use that example of these young Tibetan nuns. I always use this story. You mightn't have heard me before, Marco. When I ran the prison project in California in the 90s and 2000s, well, 90s, I forget, whatever it was. And I went to a conference that Richard Gere organized when the Dalai Lama, he invited the Dalai Lama to New York, and he invited 20 former prisoners, a whole cross section of Americans, you know, black, white, Native Americans, male, female, all of whom had had some intense experience of suffering in prison due to racism, whatever, politics, whatever, you know, Puerto Ricans, everything. And it was a very moving day, all talking about their suffering. And he also invited 2 young Tibetan nuns who'd been, you know, sexually abused and tortured for years in prison. And these young women, this is the thing that was so shocking to the Americans. You could see they were not traumatized. They were not angry. They were not pulling their hair out. Why did this happen to us? Because they have a philosophical view that's very confident for them. They've been brought up this, and it's been in their culture for 1200 years, that it's all due to karma. So they own it, and they're able to bear it and able to work through it and own it and not be traumatized. They suffer, but they come out of it more compassionate and more wise. Even my friend, and this is what I find so interesting, even my friend Sonny, whom I always quote, who's in prison, American in prison since the 70s, accused of murdering 2 policemen with a husband, completely innocent. The husband got executed. I mean, the most awful suffering for years in prison, but she was able to deal with it. She found her own methods. She's not a Buddhist. She did yoga. She said, I knew I had the choice. She had this nightmarish experience of being in these cells for years. She was completely innocent. You know, she knew she could change her mind. So she dealt with her suffering. She didn't suppress. She didn't deny. She didn't build up rage and despair. She worked with herself. So when I've met many people who've been through the prison system, and it is traumatic. It is suffering. And if you don't have methods to deal with it, you can come out really injured emotionally. You know, she's like this little old lady now, 80 something, you know, she's the same age as me, maybe a bit older. You'd never know these years of torture and suffering she had, because she dealt with it. She worked with it. She delved deep into her being and worked with it. And so she came out a happy, content, kind, compassionate person. So dealing with what's there is what we're talking about. Dealing with your mind, dealing with it, understanding it, having a method for working with it. That's what we're talking about, you know, Marco. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yes,
Thank you. Very kind, darling. Thank you. So Cassia, go on. Sweetheart.
Hi, Robina. You kind of answered part of my question. I guess I'm just speaking from the side of when, like, my tendency is to have a strong physical reaction. So like if I get angry, you know, I might shake, or if I get anxious, I can feel it, you know, in different parts of the body. That's where
right.
First
Right.
I feel the physical.
Exactly.
And then I think, oh, okay, so what's going on? You know, am I anxious? Am I angry? So you're saying deal with the mind. There's a lot to unpack there, but
Masses. I believe it's unbelievable. So much and all we can do is start with now, Cassia. We have this view in our culture, we've got to dig into the past. Don't worry, we can do that, but start with the now. What's going on now? And then, because the patterns are there. We got born with these patterns, you know.
right.
Go on.
So with aversion, because I think I have a strong tendency to want to avoid things too.
Sure. Yes.
So like the bravery, the courage, having the confidence, you know, I can do these things, you know, like what would you suggest though with dealing with the aversion, knowing that that's a strong tendency to want to avoid it, to, you know, to just want it to be okay, you know, that type of thing.
No, that's of course. I mean, this is so typically how we are, sweetheart. We all, so, but giving the words to it, the attachment in us is this constant hunger to have everything to be lovely. It's natural. And then the second it doesn't get it, that's when like a panic attack arises, and it's called aversion.
Freak out.
So we have to, depending on our habits and our other states of mind, because they all work together, you know, is how we respond. So like you said, though, already you said you feel the response in your body, but even by that point, that's already a bit late. See, the body is a very good indicator of what's going on in the mind, and we're so addicted to our bodies. Our trouble is we don't notice what's going on in our mind until our body shows it. And sometimes that can be too late. So that's why a daily practice, even if you're just sitting there, you know, doing a simple daily practice of just watching your breath for 5 minutes, being silent, having focus, because if you're just focusing on one thing for 5 minutes, you can't help but allow all the thoughts are chatting away, and you can't help but be noticing them. You don't pay attention to them, but you can't help but be noticing them. And we have to learn to develop these skills to be aware of the thoughts that inform the emotions before they become emotions. That's the long-term skill we really need to cultivate, and we are capable of that. It just takes time.
Okay.
You understand, darling?
I do. So, you know, like I think anxious, you know, being anxious, it's very strong too.
Yes, it is very strong.
So
That's attachment and aversion kind of mixed together.
Yeah.
Anxiety is, if only this happens, why, or maybe that'll happen, maybe this won't happen, maybe if that doesn't happen, what if that doesn't happen, maybe that'll happen. We're sort of trying to grasp onto it, it's going to control it. That's attachment's energy, is this control freak that wants to make it all lovely. And we have to realize we cannot control the whole world. And that's what, see, attachment is wanting everything to be lovely. So then attachment reaches out and tries to manipulate to make it lovely. And it's not possible. We go mad. It's not possible. We have to have this courage. Then that means to have the courage to allow the unhappy things to happen without going crazy. Learn almost to greet the problem. You know, that's very intense. It's very powerful, because we can't stand the problem. And so the anxiety is like, you know, kind of the interplay of attachment and aversion. And attachment is this junkie that wants it to be lovely and then wants to control it to make it lovely. And can't stand the problems. I mean, we can't stand the problems, you know. So part of it is to just accept that there are going to be problems and learn to have the courage to see it. Oh, that's how it is. It's okay. This is huge. I mean, I'd say it's easy enough to say it, but it's really huge. And to have confidence to be steady, one step at a time, dealing with what's arising. The bad thing happens, the red light comes, the boyfriend says this. Attachment is like so instinctive, responding. So we just got to keep steady, learn to know our mind and just go steadily. Go steady and allow the bad thing to happen. It won't make us crazy, you know. Even, I mean, it's easy to say this, but this is the job, you know.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Because we can't stop them, Acacia. I know, I was very funny as kids. I've got 7 siblings in my family, and we had a few traumas. Everybody has their traumas, you know. It's join the universe, dysfunctional families. I mean, I adore my family, whatever. And we all had we joke now, we all had our own ways of dealing with the problems. So my way of dealing, what's happened?
Oops.
What's going on, Alexis? What a wonderful screen. My God, look at her screen. Alexis.
I'm so sorry. I hit a button.
You did indeed.
I'm so sorry.
There you go. Well done. So, you know, one of my sisters, we've all got attachment, we've all got aversion. Okay. We all respond differently. So my way, I didn't mind crazy things happening. I didn't care, you know. My father would drive really crazily and my mother would have mental breakdown. My sister would have mental breakdown. I didn't mind. I didn't mind violence. I don't know. Don't ask me why. It's just my mind, you know. So it didn't traumatize me. But my other sister, she would like, because she was the pacifier in the family. She tried to make everything lovely. And so she tried to organize everybody to make sure everybody was in the right place at the right time so things didn't get out of control. She couldn't stand the apple cart being upset. I didn't mind the apple cart being upset. Do you understand? So she was living in constant anxiety, trying to manipulate things and control things. Well, if Daddy comes home drunk at 9 o'clock and Mummy's there and Julie's over here and Rabina's there, if I get Rabina in her room and put Mummy in her room, nothing will go wrong. She tried to organize it all. You understand? That's anxiety, honey. That's attachment gone berserk. Do you understand? Do you understand?
Yes, I can relate to that.
There you go. That's a typical kind of way of some people, their approach, you know?
Yeah.
And we joke about it because she's always trying to make everything lovely. She goes to a restaurant, she wants to make everything perfect. That's what we mean by control freak. That's one of the functions of attachment, because attachment wants everything to be lovely. We
Mhm.
can't stand things going the way we don't want. And that all manifests differently according to our personality, you know.
Yeah, my mom used to say that I was the peacekeeper, but
There
really,
you go. That's exactly the one,
same
darling
thing.
girl.
Yeah,
That's
same
exactly
thing.
the point. And that means, and you know, that's why, you know, that's exactly one. You hit it on the head, babe.
Okay,
So have
thank you.
courage and allow things to be crazy. It's okay, Cassia.
Okay,
Think like
Thank
that.
thank you.
Yes, then who's there? Andrew, talk to me.
Yes, thank you. I actually just was introduced to you on YouTube yesterday and then found that TNL was having this today. So I thought I'd had to
Oh,
jump
good Lord.
in.
Okay, happy
Yeah,
to meet you, Andrew.
I like your energy. I
Good,
appreciate
darling.
it.
Good.
Specifically, I think you've hit on it a little bit already in what you just said, Cassia. But I find myself several times a year, I freak out that I'm dying for something or
That's
other.
interesting. That's very fascinating. Go on, go on.
And one thing or another. But then what makes it worse is I think, oh, because I'm freaking out, I'm going to die very ungracefully. And then I'm going to come back as an ant a million
There you
times.
go. I hear you, darling. I hear you.
So now I'm freaking out about my freak out, right?
Now, there you
So-
go, Andrew. This is so classic. This is so typical, darling. I mean, yeah, that's right. It's like, how fascinating. That's very fascinating. A lot of people have that one, and either themselves dying or somebody else dying, you know.
Mhm.
I mean, there's somebody I know too who's like really serious panic attacks when she thinks about dying, right? It's true. And it's easy to say, don't do this and don't do that. We've all got our own trip, you know. Some people don't care about death. Some people, it's their worst thing possible. So how often does it arise though, Andrew, out of interest? I mean, is it once a year, once a month, once a day?
Yeah, it's fairly rare now.
Yes,
But
good.
you know, so I just went to the doctor recently and he said, oh, you have an abnormal reading. And I say, oh, my heart's going to explode. I'm going to die, you know. So
I understand.
that was Friday. So that's back on right now.
Oh my
Yeah.
God. So, you know, I mean, as long, I mean, you seem already to know, you already understand it in a sense. You already understand there's a particular one that you've got, your particular fear. And everybody's got something because this is how we are. And I think all we can do with them try, because when fear arises, fear is, we all know by definition, fear is irrational, you know.
Mhm.
I mean, and the other thing is though, there might be fear there, but also it is true. You see, you got one of the ways approaching, this is one I said to one person, one woman who lives in fear of her husband dying every day, you know. And I said, well, one approach, this is kind of very direct. I said, you know, some people would say, oh, don't be silly. Of course he's not going to die. Well, that's rubbish. He is going to die. And you are going to die, Andrew. But then you say to yourself, well, you know, I will die. And I don't know when it is, but meanwhile, let's work on my mind. Let's stay steady. Let's accept, because by having a fear of something happening, you're living in denial of it. So by opening the door to it and confronting it, and I said to accept that he will die, but then what's the conclusion? Not fear or panic, or not try to stop it because you can't, but then to think, great, I'm going to make the most of every second. And then if you wake up in the morning and he's still there, it's a bonus, you know. So then confront the truth of it. It's like, you know, everybody in the world can see that your girlfriend's cheating on you. You're the last person to find out. You understand? So living in denial of something is where the biggest pain comes. It's evident. I mean, death is real. As you know very well, the Buddhist teaching says one of the first things you have to realize, the reason isn't to make us fearful, but it's to give us a wake-up call. And so your conclusion has to be, okay, I'm going to die, but I don't know when. But meanwhile, let's make the most of it. Let me make the most of my life, do what I can, enjoy my life, make the most. And then you open the door to accepting the truth of it. And that eventually alleviates the panic, you know, because I mean, you're seeing it as true, not denying it. I mean, slowly, Andrew, it's obviously very primordial in you, you know.
Yeah, it's right. It's there, and it's right there in the First Noble Truth. I guess he gives that example.
Exactly, of course, exactly. Because
So-
it is true. It was, and the reason we suffer so badly now is only because we've lived in denial of death and we just can't stand the thought of it. So by confronting it and eventually internalizing it as a truth, it's no longer in the front. It just becomes something that you know is true, and so your life then is adjusted. I mean, all the lamas say that, you know, when you really begun to realize death and impermanence, already you transform your life because you don't waste time. You don't waste yourself. You're full of enthusiasm because you don't want to waste this precious life. That is the conclusion that comes. I mean, that takes time.
So
Go on.
if I then start becoming anxious, I'm not living well enough.
Oh yeah,
What's-
that's just an automatic tendency we have to always think we're not doing well enough.
Right.
And that's a function of attachment that means we're never satisfied, Andrew. That's where you've got to be very humble and again look at the facts. Based on what you're saying, it sounds like you're practicing. So you should be really seeing the incredible virtue, the incredible goodness that you're doing. We don't ever see that. When sort of like, we get to grade 1 and we think, oh, I'm only in grade 1. Then you get to grade 47, I'm only in grade 47. Then you get to grade 920, I'm only in grade 920. The default assumption of attachment is to never be satisfied. So that's an attachment problem. Learn to be satisfied with who you are. Speak truth to yourself. I am doing this. I'm living in my vows. I'm doing my practice every day. Amazing. And really point out the good things. Ego loves to see the bad things. That's a really classic one. You've got to see the good things and you've got to speak them out to yourself. I'm doing the best I can. I'm doing really well. I'm moving forward. I'm working on my mind. I'm trying to be useful. I mean, if you compare, I mean, even Andrew, even to be aware of your own mind on this planet, it's not being rude to anybody, is a pretty rare thing. So you should be very blissed out that you're wanting to be conscious. You're wanting to be aware. You're wanting to turn yourself into a better person. That's pretty amazing. So try and delight in your good qualities, please.
That's great. Thank you so much.
All right, Andrew. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, go on. We have got more time. If you people want more things, come on.
We have Bob.
Go, Bob. Talk to me.
Hello, I am one of the people who is having my concept smashed, like you were talking about in the beginning, by this concept of karma.
Okay.
And
Good,
what I would like to explain, or just kind of ask you to clarify and make sure I've got it right.
Yeah.
So like Western psychology says that we're kind of born blank slates and that the trauma that happens to us is what makes us who we are.
Yeah.
And it sounds like what you're saying is we are who we are when we get here.
Right.
And that dictates the way we react to the karma. To the trauma.
Absolutely, no question.
And that's why it seems like they kind of go together, looking back on it now. But in reality, I had the reaction to whatever happened to me as a kid because of something that happened far before this lifetime even occurred.
Well, okay. So if you can think that today, if you look at yourself, if you look at yourself today and you look back in the last 10, 20 years, you can say you're the product of those 20 years. You can't divorce yourself from those 20 years, can you? Everything you've done in the past 20 years is producing who you become. Well, all Buddha's saying is you just continue that, but before this birth, that's all. That you come into this life programmed with your tendencies. And this is not trying to be horrible, but we tend to think everybody's an innocent victim, especially if you're a child. But Buddha says, excuse me, Hitler was a child once. You can't blame his Jewish mummy for wanting to go kill 6 million Jews because his mummy or somebody was mean to him. It's kind of almost naive. The Buddha's view is we all come with so much programmed in our minds in the same way we do today from the last 20, 30, 40 years, in the same way from past lives. And so when we can see then with little children, so many children are different. It's fairly evident why so many children in the same family even. My 7 siblings, each of us responded so differently to the same problems. Some were traumatized, some were not. Like I'm talking about my one sister and me alone. And we know this, but we can't quite work out how and why that is. So, I can tell you experiences, like I quoted this morning in the Indian teachings about trauma. There's one Tibetan monk I know, a young monk. Now he's older, but when he was very little, he was brutalized by his father. But he had, in his own mind, he had not much anger, and he had an ability to have empathy for his father, even as his father was abusing him. He somehow had some empathy for his father. So he kept away from his father, but he never was that traumatized by it because he had a way of understanding it, a way of dealing with it. I taught my own self, my own response to that certain experience. I didn't therefore suffer from it. Another person might have been completely traumatized and never walk out the door again because they're terrified of every man on the planet. But so we've got stuff in us already that is what we bring to our experiences, even as babies, So it's not set in stone, but learning to become familiar with this mind of ours and using the Buddha's analysis of these different states of mind. Buddha's got a very detailed analysis. Then we can learn to know ourselves now, and then that helps us then, understand how we dealt with things before. It's a very intricate kind of knowledge that the Buddhist view says we should develop and can develop of our own mind. It's quite unique to the Buddhist approach, actually, quite precise, actually. But the karmic view is kind of outrageous in some sense. But it's also, for me, when I first heard it, It was a liberation for me. It was a revelation for me that suddenly I realized I can be in charge. I mean, if you don't know, I didn't ask to get born. It's not my fault. And we're looking in all the genes, the DNA. Who is it? We go back to the monkeys trying to find the causes. Whereas if you go back into your own mind, you will find the causes. I find it very empowering. I never found it very oppressing. You know, I found it very empowering that if I am who I am, I can become who I want. That I'm the boss.
That was incredibly helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's good. I'm happy, Bob. Thank you. Well, darling people, I mean, maybe it's a good note to finish on, or I haven't given you 60 minutes. I'll slow you about 10 minutes, 8 minutes. Not that anyone's counting. Maybe if there aren't any more questions, that's enough food for thought for today. What do you think? Precious people. No one else there, Alexis? Well,
No.
honey, I think it's enough. I think it's enough. All right, good enough. Any tools from this? Just keep working, people. Keep moving one step at a time. We're the boss. That's what I love to say about the Buddhist view. There's no concept of a creator. Mummy and daddy aren't the main fault or the main blame. We bring our own mind with us. Of course, we've got to navigate all that because it's quite a different approach. But the main teaching for me, the main learning from this concept of karma is that we're the boss. That if I produce who I am, I can create who I become. And that it's very empowering. So the more you take this view, and I can see those with these young Tibetan nuns. Oh yeah, that's right. I didn't finish the story with those young Tibetan nuns. I didn't finish the story. That's right. I didn't finish the story. These young Tibetan nuns tortured, you know, and there they were. I was talking about how for the Americans, it was shocking to see that they weren't suffering. They weren't so traumatized. But at the end, one of them said, she was in tears, and she said, and of course, we had compassion for our torturers because we knew we had harmed them in the past, but mainly because they will suffer in the future. So, I mean, a whole nother discussion is compassion. Let's talk about that next week. Compassion in Buddhist view is based upon the fact that we're all in the same boat. We've all had countless lives. We've all harmed and loved each other countless times. And, you know, the tragedy is we don't realize that we don't realize we have the power. We keep looking outside. Where is the problem, you know? So owning it inside. So having the view of karma, and I can see this in my own small problems in my own life, that the more I take on the view of karma, the less victim you become, the more ownership, the more courage, the less fear, the less suffering, because it's sort of owning it, owning yourself and knowing you've got this marvelous potential, you know, this amazing potential. There's not, Lama Zopa says we can mold our mind into any shape we like. Anyway, there you go. So these nuns was quite a shocking thing to hear from these, you know, and of course we had compassion for our torturers. Maybe we have that one day, but start with compassion for ourselves, one step at a time. Thank you, precious people. Next week or whenever we're supposed to meet again. I don't know. I'll look on the calendar. Thank you, darlings. Thank you, Alexis. And I'm sorry I'm late. I just got caught up in my phone conversation and I forgot.
Thank you.
Thank you, darlings.